I can start, Alan. It's
Yes.
1 o'clock. Yep.
Absolutely.
Namaste, everyone, and welcome to this session of yoga. This is the second year we are doing this from Integrated Cultures and Integrated Women's Network with the support of the High Commission of India and the Ayush Information Cell in Melbourne. So grateful to all of them and the volunteers and all of you who attend yoga sessions and to the practitioners and teachers who give of their time so readily. So thanks for supporting in making the world a healthier place through yoga. So many of you know Alan very well, but I still feel that there are many facets to Alan and his great experience in yoga. Alan started practicing yoga in 1975 in Sydney and he commenced teaching in 1982. He participated in the first teacher assessments in Australia in 1987. He previously established schools in Newtown in Sydney and the Blue Mountains and opened Yoga Mandir in Canberra in January 2005. So since we had the talk last year, they have moved from the Canberra city to Belconnen and now they are at a beautiful place in Fishwick in Canberra. Alan Goode holds a junior advanced level 2 teaching certificate and he has studied regularly at the RIMY Institute in Pune, India with the Iyengar family for 35 years. So I feel so envious of you, Alan, that you had such good training from the great maestro himself. But having read a little bit about him, it must have been very rigorous and not easy. And to make all those trips to India in the 70s and 80s must have been very difficult because those days travel wasn't as easy as it got later. And Alan also has extensive experience in teaching Iyengar yoga to all levels of student, from beginners through to experienced, and remedial classes for those with injuries and medical conditions. Alan trains teachers, conducts workshops, and runs professional support and development programs for teachers, including training teachers to become teacher trainers. Alan is passionately involved with the practice of yoga and its application to daily life. Through his writing, he unravels the themes of the Yoga Sutras and demonstrates their link to our daily practice. Alan has developed an extensive resource library and engages in ongoing research work to support teacher development. Alan also contributes significantly to the teacher assessment and strategic planning activities of Iyengar Yoga Australia. Last year, through this same network, Alan gave 2 talks, Yoga in the Modern World and Yoga Marga, the role of practice in the path of yoga. Today, Alan is going to talk about Ashtanga Yoga. This identifies the 8 limbs of yoga and their relevance to our daily lives. I think we'll first have the talk, Alan, and then the question and answers. And maybe they can also put their questions in the chat. Is that all right?
Yes. I've improved my knowledge of Zoom over the last year. I can't say I'm quick on chat, but I can at least find it these days.
I think you're better than me anyway. Okay, thank you, Alan, and you can start now whenever you're ready.
Good.
Namaste again. Welcome to those who were a bit late. And if you can all mute your microphones, that will be really good. Thank you very much.
So first of all, thanks Jayanti for the introduction, but also thank you for the invitation and to acknowledge your work in setting up these talks in the lead up to the International Day of Yoga, also in recognition of the High Commission of India, whose work since the inaugural International Day of Yoga has supported these yearly events. what I plan to do, what I'm hoping to do is maybe take about, I'd say I'll try to stay to half an hour in what I have to say. And then, as Jayanti just said, if we put your comments and questions to the end. So if you've got things that you'd like to highlight, add, or question, I mean, part of that is part of what these sessions are about. What I'm planning to do is, as I talk, I'm actually going to swap over and share my screen and go to a PowerPoint. And I'll talk as I deliver that PowerPoint. Now, I make that decision to use images, to use a visual, because I think it just helps to hold an awareness. It's almost like to hold a picture or image of the detail helps. So in a moment, I'll switch over. We'll go to PowerPoint. I think my image is still there, and I'll just talk to each of these slides. There's only, there's probably 8 slides, so it's not a lot. But the content that I have to deliver sort of does involve a little bit of complexity. That image I'm hoping will help. So let's see if I can share my screen. I share my screen. I'm about to go to a slideshow. And then I'm going to ask, let's have a look. I just need someone, actually, either maybe Wiggy or Svenja. I can see you both on the edge of my screen. If you can just tell me, can you see that slide? Yeah, great. Now, 2 years ago, I never would have done that to anyone. And nowadays I spend my life doing that or that. So you'll have to get used to it, but it is a good code and I get the information. So thank you. So this talk is on Astanga Yoga. And the very fact that we use that term Ashtanga, 8 limbs, says that we are involved in Patanjali's practice. The Yoga Sutras, if you're not aware of it, the Yoga Sutras is nowadays dated about, well, it's often dated now around 400 CE, the Common Era. So it's in a period of time, a period of development, which also captures the Bhagavad Gita, another significant, important text for yogis. But I'm going to be looking at, first of all, we'll identify the principles that Patanjali carries in that text in the Yoga Sutras. And then we'll look at Ashtanga specifically, but I can only really talk about my experience. And that's really where I based myself, my experience of yoga, which has been so profoundly influenced by Iyengar himself. And as you noted, Jayanti, for me, traveling to India since the early 1980s, as you said, Jayanti, in those days, it was like going to another, not just another country, but another planet. In that you couldn't ring home, you couldn't communicate, there wasn't, you would not send off an email. Essentially, you would go and then a month later, you would get off a plane and find out what had happened in your own world. So for me, it was a practice of immersion. I would go, I would spend a month just practicing, working, studying in the institute, and that's sort of largely how I learned. So I can only really talk, when I talk not about an academic understanding of Ashtanga, but through that lens that Iyengar framed. And I'll try to bring both facets to this talk. So I want us to go in the very first instance. I want us to go to, in a way, a map of Patanjali's system. In the Yoga Sutras themselves, Patanjali starts off, there are 4 chapters, and Patanjali starts off in the first chapter, and he says, if you want to achieve yoga, if you want to achieve an experience of integration, or I could use equanimity, then he says, apply abhyasa and vairagya. He says, if you want to achieve yoga, practice action and dispassion. But he says that this is very difficult. It's difficult for human beings to be dispassionate. That in fact, he says, I give this practice for those who are highly evolved. Now, it's worth noting that at that period in Indian culture was a flourishing period for the ashrams, for spiritual life. Here's Patanjali saying there's a practice of action and dispassion, but actually hard, really hard, and few people achieve it. Iyengar, in one of his books called Light on Astanga Yoga, a very small book, he says that in the culture at that time, it was a culture of practice. It was a culture of spiritualism. And so he says, Iyengar himself says, hard for us to practice action and dispassion. Patanjali goes on, and in the second chapter, he gives another set of practices. And he says, actually, this is much easier. And this second set of practices is called the Kriya. And he says, this is for those of moderate means. People, householders is how it's often thought about. Somebody who's living a householder's life, it's often advised better that you practice the Kriya. Now, the Kriya Yoga is made up of tapas, a level of application. So it's generally said, get yourself a practice. Now, we'll come back to what that practice is, but you should have a practice. The second element, svadhyaya, study yourself through a practice. And thirdly, surrender yourself in the practice. So in a way, this first breakdown, abhyasa and vairagya, action and dispassion, for those who are intense in their focus. Often I would say somebody living maybe a monastic lifestyle, someone who is not pulled into the mundane issues of life. But the Kriya in this second circle is really about something that you do in your life. Patanjali says you should practice and apply yourself. Now, then he goes on and he identifies the 8 limbs, the Ashtanga. And it's said that the 8 limbs are central to an understanding of Patanjali's system. Previous to this, there had been a 6-limbed practice, but Patanjali coined the 8 limbs. He went through, and these are really significant in the world of yoga. Now, Iyengar did something, and this is the area we're going to be looking at. Iyengar did something, and he said, I'm going to take asana and pranayama, which are 2 of the 8 limbs. So they're the 3rd and 4th limb. And he said, I'm going to make them my practice. Now, his distinction. So I call the asana and pranayama 2 of the 8 limbs. I call these our practices. Now, when I say that, I'm referring to people who work within the system that I work. I practice these things daily. But Patanjali doesn't say you have to practice asanas daily. Patanjali says you have to practice yoga daily. And there are many different forms of yoga. Last year, I talked upon Yoga Marga, the path of yoga, and the different approaches to that path. I talked about the Bhagavad Gita, and it talks to a person, a householder in their life. So you could make serving your family your practice. You could make volunteering your practice. I sometimes caricature it as you could have a practice of swimming as your practice of yoga, but it should apply tapas, svadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana. So Iyengar says, I'm going to make asana and pranayama the thing I do each day. And that's why I use that our practices. But he goes on to say, he calls the Ashtanga the 8 disciplines. And this is where I want to take us now. But just before we go there, I'm going to read a little segment of a quote. And it's quite a long quote, but I'm trying to sort of trim it back for you. He says, this comes from the Tree of Yoga. Iyengar says, though yoga is often considered in the West to be only physical, it is also a physio-psychological and psycho-spiritual subject. It is a science which liberates one's mind from the bondage of the body and leads it towards the soul. When the mind reaches and merges with the soul is free and remains thereafter in peace and beatitude. Now, I take that little excerpt out of quite a long passage, but Iyengar is saying why we practice yoga is not just to stretch the body, not just for relaxation, even, you could say, not even just for mental health. He's saying its aim is, and I'll say transcendent, but to move beyond the small worlds that we live in, the things I worry over, the things that I stress over, the things that I don't have and wish I had. And he said a practice of yoga should move us beyond that, to see the world clearly. What Iyengar did, he said, I'm going to, understanding these layers, that action and dispassion in the first chapter, the Kriya in the second chapter, and then the 8 disciplines. Now, I want to look at why Iyengar did that. And it's in this next quote. This is what Iyengar did with, or through his practice, but with the 8 limbs and Patanjali system. And this quote on the page, he uses Mahatma Gandhi. And I think I talked about this last year, but it's such a significant point for me. And I think for those of us who practice this specific type of yoga. He says, Mahatma Gandhi, so he's referencing somebody, and many of you will know the history of Gandhi and the movement to free India from British rule. Mahatma Gandhi did not practice all the aspects of yoga. He only followed 2 of its principles, non-violence and truth. And yet through these 2 aspects of yoga, but actually 2 aspects of Yama, he mastered his own nature and gained independence for India. If a part of Yama could make Mahatma Gandhi so great, so pure, honest, and so divine, should it not be possible to take another limb and through it to achieve the highest goal of yoga? Now, if I go back a moment, he says, I'm going to take one of the limbs in that example or in that quote, asana, and I'm going to practice in a way that applies these 8 disciplines to achieve an experience of inner poise, or I could say balance, to find a level of integration. And as I said earlier, you could choose anything. The world of yoga now looks like everyone does stretches, and that's yoga. But when I started in 1975, I started in a very different system of practice. And we did a few asanas, and then we sat very quietly and we watched a candle. But it's the same. It's a different approach or a different application of these 8 limbs. And in all of the schools of thought, so across the history of yoga, there are different lineages and different schools of thought. And across these schools of thought, you'll get different practices. Some will have practices for Yama, non-violence. I think I did last year, I used the Jain religion as their primary focus is on non-violence. So you have different schools of thought and different priorities given to different limbs. But Iyengar, in this system, he says, I will apply them as disciplines within the practice. I'm going to use the asana as my practice, and I'm going to apply these limbs as disciplines rather than practices in themselves. And that's probably one of the most fundamental steps that he took. Because when I started, we had practices for non-violence. We had practices for truth, for cleanliness. But Iyengar says something, he does something subtle and quite different. And that's what I want to talk to. What Iyengar is saying in this quote is really important, possibly to understanding him. Here was a man who grew up, from memory, 1918, he was born, but he grew up through the inter-war years. And in that period, he watched India, the struggle in India to gain independence from the British. He watched the tragedy of what people were living like and going through under a colonial power. And he put in place the salt marches, the spinning wheel, khadi, the making homespun it was. And so Indian culture set up a resistance to British rule, which was not based on violence, but was based on non-violence. And Iyengar saw that. And you can only say, possibly for everyone who lived in that period, that it was profound, that India was regaining its own autonomy. And Gandhi was central to that. That influenced Iyengar greatly in his practice. He says, you do not need to practice everything, but how you practice is central. It's not what you practice, not what you say, it's how you live. And that was Gandhi's thing. Gandhi says, we will spin our own cotton to rebel against the British. And as many in this group will know, the image on the Indian flag, the Ashok Chakra, which is also part of the Yoga Mandir logo. The Ashok Chakra is actually a wheel with spokes, and it was reworked under the freedom movement to be a spinning wheel. And so Indians across the country took up spinning their own clothes, and it became this thing called khadi, which is homespun, jackets, and the whole, what are they called? The political movement that took India to independence was based on homespun. All the politicians wore homespun material, and this was a resistance movement. Now, I read to you a quote around this point by Iyengar. And Iyengar is saying, I'm not going to practice all the 8 limbs. I'm going to practice asana, and I'm going to use it as a way, not of resistance, as the khadi movement did, but as a way to study myself. He says, in each posture, in each action, you should be able to find yoga in its integrity, according to Patanjali's explanations. Patanjali has not said 8 steps. All these put together are yoga. But unfortunately, people who have not practiced at all say what you're doing is physical. Yama and niyama, when you're doing an asana, the ethics of the right foot and the ethics of the left, are they even or not? Now, I'm going to stop there, and I'm just going to see that. First of all, he says not 8 steps. So it's not this, then that, then that. It's 8 limbs. And so the image of a tree is used. And like the limbs of a tree, they all contribute. To go again, in each posture, each action, you should be able to find yoga in its integrity. That's his response, I would say, to Gandhi's movement. It is not going out into the world and complaining and picketing and signing things. It's how do you act within yourself? And in doing so, Iyengar places himself firmly in the Kriya. He says, I am a person who practices. Now, and the way to understanding is in the Kriya, is through practice. Now, again, another quote by Iyengar. In the second chapter, Sadhanapada, Patanjali comes to the level of the spiritually unevolved to help them to aspire. He coins the word Kriya Yoga. Kriya means action, and Kriya Yoga emphasizes the dynamic effort made by the sadhaka or practitioner. And here he is again. It is composed of 8 yogic disciplines. So he's putting you don't go out and practice non-violence, but your behavior, you should study yourself. And so really one of the way I normally characterize this is I might go out and sign a petition against something. I support some act of non-violence. But then I go home and I kick the cat and scream at people. He says, not what you say in the world, but how you are within yourself. Violence exists within an individual. Study yourself. And how to study yourself, it is within your practice. And so when he talks about the ethics of the right foot, the ethics of the left, he's applying, I could say, he's applying Mahatma Gandhi's approach. I'll take something and through it, I will use it to achieve something. He's saying I'll take asana, the postures, but I'll study myself and whether I am violent, whether I am forceful, truthful. What Iyengar did in these couple of steps was he defined yoga as a practice rather than a belief, as something that is practical rather than something you just hope for. And it should affect you, not just how you feel, but how you act. And in those terms, he's absolutely aligned with Mahatma Gandhi and with Patanjali. Now, what are the 8 limbs? This slide gives you a breakdown. Now, I'm very clear that we're not going to go through each of these, and I'm not going to talk through, but each of them, for a practitioner, each of them will be reflected, practiced upon, reflected upon, observed, and through a practice. But I just want to note, and this again is another step in the world that I live in, Iyengar Yoga. But here we have a table of these 8 limbs. At the very top, we have Yama, the first of the Ashtanga. And Yama is made up of 5 things: non-violence, ahimsa; satya, truth; asteya, non-stealing; brahmacharya, restraint; aparigraha, non-acquisition. It's followed by niyama, sausha, santosha, tapas, svadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana. Now, these two, if you look on the very left of the slide, you'll see that these two are under a sort of first column. It says observances. What Iyengar did was he came to a point, and it was in that quote that I was just reading. He says, instead of practicing non-violence, I'm going to look or study myself. Am I violent in my behaviors, my approach to my practice? Am I truthful in my practice? When I practice, am I trying to get things without doing the work to get them? So am I stealing? Am I coveting things? And so the whole of the world of Iyengar yoga and the world of yoga in general is what's classed as a self-study, a self or a reflective practice. But Iyengar, he groups the 8 limbs into 3 groups, and they're on the very left of this slide. He says the observances, so we don't practice non-violence, but we observe them within our practice. It's an ethical foundation, or how to approach the practice. And so the first 2, yamas and niyamas, he says these are the ethics that underpin us both in life and in practice. And then he says the middle 3, asana, pranayama, and pratyahara. The middle 3. He says these 3 involve effort, and therefore they can be practiced. And so when I use the word our practice, it is these 3 that I do as my daily activity. And then he does something again, which I'd never seen before I came across Iyengar. He says the last 3, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. These last 3 are the fruits of practice. Now, what's significant about that is when I first started doing yoga, 1975, and probably for the first 5 years that I practiced, I used to sit and stare at a candle. I would practice meditation. Now, there's a book of his, Tree of Yoga, and there are 2 passages, 2 chapters in there where he talks about the nature of meditation. He makes a distinction that I'd never ever seen before. And he said, you do not practice meditation. You practice concentration. When one experiences meditation, it is an outcome. It's not something where if you're actively working at it, you're practicing concentration. Concentration merges into meditation when it loses its purposeful nature. Now, I won't expand on that anymore, other than to say, Iyengar put the practices, these 3, at the center of what we do each day. And he said, if you want to evaluate your practice, it should develop concentration. The outcome should be you feel steady in your focus. You should feel quiet and achieve a meditative state. And eventually, you should feel an inner peace. That was Iyengar's application of the Astanga, the 8 limbs. What Iyengar did, and always I think for me it's quite important, firstly within the community I work in, the Iyengar community, try to be quite clear with our community that we're not trying to perfect asana. What we're trying to do is, as Mahatma Gandhi did, to use these practices that are on the screen here. I practice asana, I practice pranayama, and I practice directing my senses, focusing myself. But these should achieve an outcome. Do they steady the mind? Do they quieten the mind? And do they resolve you? But it can be done in many ways. Iyengar, in a way, was unusual in that he brought the asanas right into the foreground. He said, I'm going to use asanas. He was intense. He was demanding as a teacher. He was physically applied. But that's not the only way. It's not the only way to practice. And I'm going to finish with this quote. And it is combined with an image of him practicing something called Virabhadrasana 2. And it's easy to think that this sort of practice is maybe for people of a certain type. Maybe you say you should be of a certain age, or you should be able, competent to do certain movements. You have to be athletic. But that's not what Iyengar was saying. Iyengar was saying that each of us can achieve a level of integration by being honest with ourselves, by being clear in our application, by being steady. Whether that means you're doing an asana like this, whether or not it means you're doing something much less dramatic, that each person should practice to their own ability. But there should be tapas, a level of application. There should be self-observation, and at a certain level, and to your capacity, a level of surrender. He says, if you extend on the right side more, and if the left side does not stretch so much, should you not observe the duality between the right and the left and make use of the left side intelligently to be on par with the right? This is known as balancing violence and non-violence. Now, it's a little quote to end with, but it is something that I think he was always not just doing stretches and looking for alignment. He was always asking the practice, asking that the practice be ethical. And ethical means to look at oneself, not to cheat, not to show off, not to merely be there for what you can get, want, or want to escape from. That the practice should integrate you. Now, in a rare moment, I think I'm finished on time. So I'm going to pause there. And I'm just going to note, I'll unshare. I'll stop my share. I'll bring us back into whatever that's called, gallery view. And just to finish, as you have a thought as to whether you want to make comment on anything I've said or investigate it further. So I've avoided going into the list of the asanas, to talking them all through in detail, because that is, in a way, that's the world of teaching and learning. But I am saying quite clearly, the links that I see, and it's the link that Iyengar made, was that he says, he's applying the 8 limbs within your practice. And I want to say, in my world, my practice is asana, pranayama, and pratyahara. But your practice may be different. It does not mean it is less or more value. All Patanjali says is you should have a practice. But how you conduct the practice and what you aim for in the practice is what's critical. Then the next step, the really critical one, is Iyengar says, I apply the 8 limbs as disciplines. And that's linked to what Mahatma Gandhi did. Mahatma Gandhi did not say in the salt marches, we're going to collect salt. He said, we're going to resist. So it was the motivation for the action. He did not say we're all going to spin jackets because it's coming close to winter. He said we're going to spin khadi to stop the British. It's the motivation. And Iyengar was taking that and he was applying it to the asana. And he says the ethics is in the practice. Now, I've already said all that, so I'm going to stop that. Now, anything you would like to add, comment on, or contest?
Alan, thank you so much. And this profound silence is a tribute to your talk, actually. Don't think we are not asking you questions. You have provided so much information that we are in some other world, not here to ask questions. So I'm just starting that, to break the silence, I'm saying this. This happened last year too. I remember there was that pregnant silence for a minute or two. It's amazing how you have taken all this and, condensed it into half an hour for us. Truly amazing.
So maybe we've done, here we go.
We have a question in the chat. Can you see, Alan?
Yes, I can.
Yep.
Good. Now that's, I'll bring that back up again, and I'll just say.
Are you able to expand a little on how pratyahara manifests or is undertaken in your daily practices? So
I can add a quick hello to Tiffany as well, since she's asked that. So Tiffany's just highlighted for us pratyahara. So in the very early in the slides, I put asana and pranayama. So in the very first quote, Iyengar says, can I not take asana and through it to achieve the highest goal? And then we saw in that slide, if you were able to go back, you'd see asana and pranayama are there. In the last or second last slide, the three were circled. And that's what Tiffany's pointing out. She says, okay, at different points, indirectly, you're saying to me, at different points, different things are being said here. Some things are being included, more things are being included. If there'll be some people in this session who understand, maybe, and many people in this group may have been to India, and a number of you have been to the Institute in Pune. And they will have classes in asana and classes in pranayama. They don't have classes in pratyahara, and yet I've circled it based on his quote. They teach these two classes, asana, pranayama, but pratyahara is a practice. And so that last quote was, second last quote was, these three involve effort. They can be practiced. I don't see it as a separate practice. I see it as every time you do an asana, you direct your attention inwards. So it is a practice in that it is done rather than achieved. It's not an outcome. It's worked for and valued. Now, without getting too technical on it, I teach, a lot of the way I teach, there's a formality. We ask people to stand in a certain way, to not distract themselves. And in a way, the very methodology of teaching asks you to direct your attention inwards. And therefore, pratyahara is a practice. It is something learned and applied. So I don't see it as separate. And if we had a lot longer, there is a lot more to say about that, but I just wanted to note to you, it holds within his comment, these three involve effort and therefore practiced. Now, I'm just going to have a look if there's Uh,
Can I make a
Ross has
comment?
his hand up.
yep.
Is that me? Yes. Hi, all. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, everybody. I'd just like to make a comment. I find it really interesting especially reading the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, where it talks about Svatmarama. When he wrote his texts, he completely omitted Yama and Niyama, and it was Patanjali, due to his contemporary Buddhist roots, that included Yama and Niyama in his 8 limbs. And yet Svatmarama apparently was more of the opinion that to attain self-discipline required in Yama and Niyama, you needed purification of the mind and purification of the body. So he left that out, apparently, so I'm asking the question, and left it to the remaining yoga practices in order to cultivate Yama and Niyama. Whereas Iyengar's got it, I know they're all self-supporting and not necessarily steps, but Patanjali starts with Yama and Niyama and puts great emphasis on it, as you say, through, especially through, Gandhi's words. And yet I find it interesting that the Pradipika doesn't really accentuate those 2 limbs.
Yeah, great. Now, I don't know that. I hadn't seen that before, but it fits now. I haven't done a lot of work in this area for a long time, but last time that I looked at the Pradipika, I thought it was dated around the 17th century. Someone might be able to clarify that. But so it's much later text. It used to sit, it was said to be aligned with the Natha yogis, who were ascetics, and therefore the practices would be given priority because I've read some stuff that said they were much more, they would practice intensely and almost gymnastically. And so the Natha yogis and that era was much more around the ascetic practices, which aligns with, if we think about martial arts, a code of conduct or disciplines within the practice, then I think what you're saying could actually stand quite well. It's like, does the practice teach the ethics, or do you put the ethics to do the practice? And then you'd be seeing, as you're noting, you'd be seeing a distinction between the Pradipika and Patanjali. Patanjali, I think you're right to say, Patanjali is saying it's an ethical practice. Now, how you get there, I'd go, well, that would be the role of a lineage teaching, to give something a priority or not. But it would acknowledge that the ethics exists. How you achieve them, where they come in the sequence of learning would also change. Iyengar, this talk, and what I'm really trying to do is to say, well, Iyengar aligned himself with Patanjali, and here's why. And so you're right, you're pointing exactly the same thing. And I think the Pradipika, one day I hope to have a bit of time. I'm hoping for a pandemic 2 or 3 years from now where I can where I can stay at home and look at the Pradipika and the Gerunda and the Siva Samhita. They're the next 2 I want to look at. But he aligns himself with Patanjali, and I think he aligns himself with the Gita. He puts himself within, Iyengar puts himself within not just the history, but the ethical practices that are defined within those 2 texts. And he's very vocal about it. I mean, he's unapologetic. Yeah, great. Thanks, Ross. Nice to see you. Any other?
Can I ask a very simplistic question? Now, there are these 8 limbs, and you said they are self-supporting, they are not steps. Now, suppose somebody started yoga practice because they had some health concerns and they were doing asanas. Or another person started by doing meditation because they wanted to start there. Over a period of time, do you think they would still go through the 8 limbs? Or is it okay if they just do the one limb that they are doing?
Good. So I see this as a lineage question, meaning across the millennia, different schools of thought give different priorities. What I hear you saying is, we could ask it specifically and say, okay, somebody has a health issue and maybe they can't practice asana. Is that a problem? They have a meditation practice, they don't have an asana practice. Is that a problem? And I think there's, it's a simple answer, no. I think we have lived through a period, and I think we're in a way very much in it, where people now think of yoga as being, it's about the physicality. It's now called, the modern language for it is modern postural practice. And I talked about it last year. When I first came across this term, I thought it was funny that anyone would call it that. But then I had to concede modern, because it's very recent that this focus on postural practice has come about. And I think you're, whether directly, deliberately or not, Jayanti, you are saying, look, there is a whole history of yoga, thousands of years, where modern, forget that, but postural practice was not seen as central to evolution in understanding. And if we look at last year's lecture on Jnana Yoga, a Jnana yogi will not see postural practice as having any great significance. What a modern response to what you are pointing at could be that the health of the body will inhibit your practice. And so to take care of your body is actually part of the world of practice. And the Bhagavad Gita puts that center stage. What if my practice, now maybe health issues, they may be limited, but I have plenty of students who they don't have a practice of asana that looks like we see Iyengar do. They maybe use supports and props. They may be learning to live with what they can't do. But the state of the body affects the mind, and the state of the mind affects the body. And so I would encourage someone to, well, it doesn't even have to be a practice of asana, but it should to bring their physicality into their practice. And that might be walking. I'll give you an example of someone, a student of mine who had something called ankylosing spondylitis, which is a form of arthritis. It can be quite aggressive and it can be very painful. It's a volatile condition. And he was finding his body was in so much pain that he couldn't practice. And in the end, we worked through that. He lived near the beach. And I said, what if every day you walk for half an hour up and down the beach? And it just gave him mental space from the fatigue or exhaustion of pain. And I said, so make that your practice. Walk up and down the beach, but do it quietly, reflectively, do it in a way that addresses, that relates to body and mind. It doesn't, you look at him from the outside and he's a man walking up and down a beach, but from the inside, he's practicing. So I think the short answer would be yes, but I think what the Ashtanga says, Iyengar says the 8 disciplines, but you could say the 8 facets to a human being, 8 aspects to a human being. Do you have values that underpin your actions? Yamas are said to be the external observances. Niyamas are said to be the internal observances. Asana is to be embodied. Pranayama is to be energetically, is about life force. It's not about breathing. It's about energy. Do we ever turn inwards? Do we ever focus our mind, steady our mind? And so you could say the 8 facets of a human being. And whether that need be anything that looks like something I do is not actually. Iyengar yoga is a moment in time. It's a moment of our time, I think, a practice of our time. It's relevant to this era where most of us spend our lives sitting in chairs at desks behind computers. So it's relevant, but it's not the only way to practice. And the history of yoga it's a drop in the ocean, Iyengar yoga.
Thank you, Alan. Do we have any other questions? Okay, then I would like to thank Alan on behalf of all of you. And I also thank all the participants, especially those from interstate, for joining today. I would also like to remind you we have a session tomorrow, totally different to what Alan's session today was. It's by Elena Amani, Yoga in the Kitchen, tomorrow, 10:45 a.m. for 11 a.m. start. And next Saturday, we have Vijay Arora ji. He's talking on 11th June, 12:45 for 1 p.m. Power of Mind Meditation. And on the 18th of June, if you happen to be in Canberra, the High Commission of India, in collaboration with the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, is celebrating the 8th International Day of Yoga with a practical demonstration of yoga asanas and meditation session by yoga expert Sri Vijay Arora. This is 10:30 for a 10:45 a.m. start at Melrose High School, Mark Street, Pierce. Our sessions are online as usual. Lakanji, do you have a question?
No.
Okay. Thank you. And we will, Alan will make the recording available and I will put it on the Yoga Talks group. Namaste and hope to see as many of you as possible tomorrow.